So we only have a couple more weeks left for college football in terms of the SEC, and the SEC championship game picture is getting very clear. At the top of the SEC standings right now, Texas is at 5-1 in conference. Texas A&M is at 5-1 in conference. So huge implications from that game at the end of the season if both teams continue to win out. Georgia's sitting at 6-2, big win over Tennessee. Tennessee's right underneath them, 5-2, and then Bama's right underneath them, 4-2. Of course, Bama lost to Tennessee but beat Georgia. And Ole Miss is sitting there at 4-2. Ole Miss's biggest win is against Georgia. So this round robin of teams beating each other is starting to play itself out in the standings. And so the question is, what does this mean for the SEC championship game in terms of who gets in and what do they have to do to get into the game?
Yeah, so the SEC championship game this year means even more than years past. Even though it was pretty much a ticket to playoffs in years before, this is really the number one way to guarantee your spot in the playoffs, and you get a bye. So we'll talk a little bit more later about whether you want to be in this game or not, if you're a fan of a team. But there's really 5 teams from that list that have emerged as potential teams to play in the SEC championship game. The top 2 are really the 2 that control their own destiny. They're the only 2 that can guarantee their spot by winning out, and that's Texas and Texas A&M, because they each have one more game and then they play each other to finish the season. The winner of that game, should they both win their game the week before, the winner of that game will go in and will likely be playing against Alabama or Georgia. Ole Miss or Tennessee could slip in there with some crazy stuff, but those are the main ones at the top.
Yep. And, for Texas and A&M, the A&M specifically, I'm sure this was not a spot you saw yourself being at the beginning of the season, brand new head coach. You control your destiny. You just got to win out. Played a pretty impressive game last week against New Mexico State. Just got to beat Auburn. You got to beat Texas. Auburn could trip you up. And then Texas, we saw them play against Arkansas last week. Pretty close game. Took care of business. Arkansas is, a tough opponent, but not, to the caliber of A&M. So it should be interesting when they play at the end of the season.
Yeah. So, if you're Texas A&M, you have the opportunity to still lose a game. You could lose to Auburn, and then you're just rooting for an Alabama loss. You could lose to Texas, and you need an Alabama loss or an Ole Miss loss. So there's ways for Texas to get in. There's some crazy scenarios for them. Really, the most likely team to be playing either Texas or Texas A&M right now is Alabama, but they can't do it themselves. If they win out, they still need one of 2 things to happen. They need Missouri to win one more game. Missouri plays Mississippi State in the next one, which would be their most likely one to win before they play Arkansas. Or you need Vanderbilt to beat Tennessee. So I think the most likely scenario is Missouri winning a game.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think that's something that Missouri can do? They're coming off of a loss. They look to have slowed down a little bit to finish the season.
Yeah, I still think they're capable of winning. I think Mississippi State is definitely a pretty tough, gritty opponent. They play a lot better than what their record reflects. They obviously still have some gaps, but I think they're hungry enough. I think Luther wants these stats for the NFL prospects. Theo Weiss has been balling out, and Brady Cook plays a lot of passion. I think they're capable of winning that game in Mississippi State. I wouldn't be surprised if they lost, though. I will say that.
Yeah.
Vanderbilt beating Tennessee would be a huge shock to me. But Tennessee's offense has been kind of sputtering over the last couple weeks here. So
yeah. If Vanderbilt wins that game, Alabama wins out. They're playing Oklahoma and Auburn. They would be playing the winner of that Texas and Texas A&M game. For Georgia, they're the next likely one. They need an Alabama loss. If that happens, then as long as A&M wins a game or Tennessee wins a game, then they're in. And it's interesting. So a lot of people didn't know this, and it took me reading into it and looking into some things to figure this out. So win the SEC championship game, you might say, okay, but Alabama beat Georgia, or Georgia beat Tennessee, but Tennessee beat Alabama. So how does that impact it? Unless it's just 2 teams tied for that spot, that gets thrown out.
Yep.
So if it is Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee all tied to go to the SEC championship game, since it's a round robin of who won that gets tossed out and they move to the next tiebreaker, which is record against common opponents. That one in a lot of these has been thrown out as well. And we're looking at opponent win percentage in conference games, not even teams that you beat. So Alabama's getting Vanderbilt's win percentage. They're getting Tennessee's win percentage added in here. So that's why Alabama relies on a Missouri win to get in, because they need to boost Missouri's win percentage. So it's crazy. There's a lot of scenarios. I mean, you could pause on this and take a look at what is on here and figure out all the different things. There's a few far out scenarios that I don't have on here. These are just the most likely.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about it, right? I know you might have mentioned it earlier about the 4th team on this list, Ole Miss. They can get in by winning out. You win the Egg Bowl against Mississippi State. You beat Florida. We'll talk about Florida later if you're watching the full episode and what's going on there. But you beat Florida. You beat Mississippi State. You need Bama. Bama lost. You need A&M to lose out, and Vanderbilt win at Tennessee. So it is possible. It's just going to take, a lot of things that would make some viewers really happy in the college football landscape, because it'd be absolute chaos.
Yeah, I mean, there's a potential here. You're rooting for Auburn to win both A&M and Alabama, and then you need Vanderbilt to win. If that situation happens, then you're good, as long as Texas also takes care of business against A&M. Now,
Yep.
with this, right, we can look at these scenarios, but it poses the bigger question, because when you're looking at the top 12 teams, the college football playoff rankings are not out yet as of the time we're recording this. But other than A&M, these teams are all kind of sitting in that top 12 already.
Yep.
If you win out, you're likely going to be in it. So when we're looking at the scenarios of these teams, the question posed, like, do you even want to be playing in the championship game? If you're Georgia, if you're Alabama and you win out, ESPN is giving you 99% chance to make it. And I think that's fair to say. Now, if you lose in that championship game, does the committee then take you out of the playoff?
Right. And when we're looking at this graphic, the team that is taken out is Ole Miss. In terms of odds percentage, right? 62% is still very favorable. But when you look at all these teams, they have great quality wins. That's why they're in that top 12. I would argue it might be more advantageous to not make the conference championship game. And only because if you're looking at teams like Bama, you talked about it before we started recording, they're controlling what they can control. If they win out and Missouri doesn't do their part, it's not like they're resting starters to not find themselves in Atlanta. They just are relying on someone else. And so if you're Bama and you have these quality wins against a quality Georgia, and you've played a good football this season, you might want to have that home playoff game if it plays out that way. So the jury's out if it does make sense to want to not make the game versus making the game. But it's quite a scenario and a question that we've never really asked before in college football.
Yeah, and knowing that Georgia just picked up a win against Tennessee, Alabama, should they take care of business the rest of the year, knowing that Indiana has to play Ohio State, knowing that the ACC championship, anything could happen. Big 12 championship with BYU losing, which we haven't talked about yet. They could, both Alabama and Georgia, should they win out and don't make the SEC championship game, there's a higher percent chance that they're playing a home game. So
yeah,
it's the question, is it better for an Alabama team to be playing is it worth it for an Alabama team? You might be at home playing a Boise State, or do you risk getting the bye? I don't think that Boise State in Tuscaloosa is a bye, but it's pretty favorable.
It's definitely pretty favorable. I think there's definitely some clout that you get from winning the conference championship. You are the solidified team. I would argue if you win the SEC, you might get the 1 seed. Maybe you jump in Oregon right now, who's sitting at number 1. Obviously, Oregon is poised to win their conference in the Big Ten, but that 1 seed could put you in a more advantageous positioning. So without fully seeing what the seeding looks like, it's tough to tell. But based upon projections of what we see with the current AP and with the CFP last week, and kind of just going off of how they've been ranking the teams, it's safe to imagine that if you're the third SEC team, you're probably getting the 6 or 7 seed. That might put you in a spot to play, the second place Big 12 team, or the second place ACC team, or maybe like a Notre Dame, or just a very favorable matchup, right? And if you win you go to the conference championship game, you lose, the most impressionable piece of your resume that the committee has to see is that loss, and you could get blown out, and then what?
Recent.
Right? And it's recent.
Yeah. That's what I think hurt Georgia last year, where they were undefeated. People have said that, last year they left Georgia after losing the SEC game. They were undefeated up to that point. 14 playoff, 12-team playoff, drastically different. So I don't think that, you can look at their mentality last year and compare it. But, it's recency. This is an Alabama team lost to Vanderbilt and Tennessee earlier in the year. How have they done since? Georgia lost to Ole Miss recently. Ole Miss losing to Kentucky early on, but now they beat Georgia, so they look better as of late, depending on what happens in that game. But if it's Georgia, Texas, or something like that, and Texas beats Georgia, it's like you don't want to leave that Georgia team out, because they've shown that they can beat Texas in Austin. So I think there's a lot more to look at. These percentages are based on ESPN FPI, so take it with a grain of salt. I personally think that if a Georgia and Alabama team, Georgia, Alabama, Texas are 3 teams that can lose in the SEC championship game and still get in. Texas A&M and Ole Miss, I think it would hurt them to make that game and lose it.
Yeah.
But those are two teams that don't control their playoff spot. They're kind of sitting on the fringe. A&M sitting outside, Ole Miss sitting right at the end of it, and not having a whole bunch of tests left. Ole Miss has Florida this week,
Right.
so it's tough to say. I'm in the camp of don't dodge a game. I'm not running. Like,
Yeah.
let's play some football.
I would want to play some football. And I think that's interesting, your take around A&M, because part of me agrees with them, because if you look at their resume right now, their best win is LSU, and it's not really looking too favorable. Second best win is Missouri. Obviously, they've fallen out of the rankings. And that's the tough part, right? When you get those key wins, those teams keep falling. I saw Josh Pate, he did a poll on Twitter where it's like, if the number 22 to 24 team loses and they fall out, is that still a ranked win? And 77% of the people at the time voted yes, that's still a ranked win. But there's so many teams that you'll beat them and they'll go from 15 to 21, 21 to 24, 24 to out. And you start looking at your resume at the end of the season, it's like, well, there's no ranked wins there because these bottom 20 teams fell out. So that's kind of the case for A&M. And so what you were saying was, for them, they're probably, in your opinion, the team that has the most to lose by making it to the conference championship game and losing when it comes to their playoff chances, which is surprising given that to get to the championship game, they'd have to beat a Texas who would be sitting in the top 10 at the time.
Yeah. But yes, that would benefit their resume and put them right there on the fringe. I think that the difference here is that Texas and Texas A&M are two teams that got the belt this year. If you look at Georgia, the Ole Miss game, sure, that you can consider that, but it wasn't like what happened in Austin to Texas. That was a beatdown. The score doesn't even really indicate the game control. And then if you want to look at Texas A&M or South Carolina, I mean, that's a spanking, man. Like, so that's where I think it matters a little bit more, where Alabama, they lost 2 games by 1 possession. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky early on. They lost to LSU, right there at the end of the game in OT. So that's where I think a Texas A&M team needs the resume boost of making it to the game, but the game matters. Where Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, I think they have Georgia, Alabama, and maybe Texas, maybe Ole Miss have enough to stand on, but definitely Georgia and Alabama.
Definitely. And, bringing it back to kind of wrap up the segment here, I'm in the same camp as you, right? Like, I want to keep playing football. I want to win, and I want to get to Atlanta, and I want to have the shot to say that I took down the second best team in the conference to win the conference championship. Like, we are the solidified team, whether that's Texas or A&M or Georgia or Alabama or Ole Miss. Like, I want that shot. And, this is so fun. There are things on the line with the Egg Bowl, with, Missouri taking on Mississippi State, whoever was against, playoff expansion. Like, I don't know what you were thinking, because this is a really, really fun, and it'll be quite the journey to see kind of who makes it to the conference championship. But those are the scenarios right now. So if you're watching this segment, let us know who you want to see and what you think is going to happen. And if you like talk like this, like, definitely tune into Brackets and Buzz. We talk a lot about the college football playoff rankings and what it means for who gets in. But for the SEC championship, I think all things run through the SEC, because right now there might be a ton of Big Ten teams in the top 12, but there's a lot of these SEC teams right now. There's only 3 or 4, but there's a lot of them that could creep in there and find themselves in that top 12. And the championship game picture and how this all plays out and who ends up where, whether it's Texas beating A&M or A&M beating Texas, or Bama, tripping up potentially against Auburn, or Ole Miss tripping up against Florida. I mean, there's so many possibilities when it comes to the playoffs and when it comes to the SEC championship game.